I'm Caucasian, I'm black. I'm Caucasian, I'm black.
In the eyes of the law.
In the eyes of the law.
That's absurd, right? The idea of you being black and then...
Well, then you're saying the law is absurd. I'm not absurd. The law is the law. We live by the rule of law.
Why did you decide to take a DNA test?
I did it just for the understanding and for the knowledge to clarify what my oral history was. And it clarified what I had known through oral history about our lineage and our heritage. My father said we were a mix of many things, which we are.
So you took a DNA test, and what did the DNA test reveal to you?
Native American, black, and Caucasian.
Was it majority Caucasian, majority black, majority Native American?
Majority Caucasian, then Native American, and then black. The black was 4%, around approximately 4%.
This man is 4% black according to his DNA results. I want you to keep that in mind as you watch this video. Because today, we're talking about the real life of T. Thomas Fortune, whose percentage of blackness was likely close to this man's, or maybe even a little bit less. Yet, he's recorded in history as one of the nation's first black journalists and newspaper editors. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that he was pretending to be black in order to gain notoriety like some people do today.
What's up, y'all? Today I got an announcement to make. A lot of y'all, I guess y'all be feeling some type of way because y'all don't really think I'm black. But Ancestry.com did tell me I was black, so I have the right to say that I'm black because I'm like Ancestry. All I know is I took the test and they said I was black.
He identified as black because he had to, according to the law of his time. Mental inertia is dead. That is a quote from T. Thomas Fortune, the subject of today's video. I find that statement to be true. I'm sure that if you Google T. Thomas Fortune, you'll see a description that reads something like, he was a journalist, editor, publisher, and civil rights leader for Black Americans in the late 1800s and early 1900s. To that end, here's another one of his quotes. The race cannot succeed nor build strong citizens until we have a race of women competent to do more than bear a brood of negative men. What's that? Blaming your lack of success as men on women? Sounds right in line with a lot of civil rights activists to me. No wonder he's considered a father of the movement. We'll get back to those civil rights leaders a little bit later. T. Thomas Fortune was much more than a list of quotes, and I'm going to tell you a lot more about him today. HBO's The Gilded Age is a television show that is brilliantly written by Julian Fellows, the creator of Downton Abbey. It's returning for its second season on October 29th, and we're gearing up for its return on this channel, Ty's Hot Mess History. I can't think of a better place. It's my favorite channel. Whether or not you watch the show, if you like historical scandals, stay tuned for this episode. I'm covering some of the real-life people, places, and events that have been depicted on The Gilded Age, the TV show. But The Gilded Age was a real time in history. It lasted roughly from the 1870s until 1900, give or take a few years, depending on which historian you ask. It was a period of massive economic change. Vast fortunes were made by a few. Sometimes those fortunes were lost. For the wealthy, it was all about the rivalry between old money families and new money families. For the working class, their thoughts were to hell with all of them, old or new. They've earned their wealth on our backs. The main characters on this show, The Gilded Age, come from fictional families that are like the old money and new money families that would have existed at that time. But they interact with some of the wealthiest and most noteworthy people who did live during the Gilded Age, like the Vanderbilts, Jay Gould, J.P. Morgan, Stanford White, Ward McAllister, and the topic of today's video, T. Thomas Fortune. This is how he is described in the show's character guide. Quote, an influential member of the Black intellectual community in New York, as an activist, journalist, writer, editor, and publisher of the New York Globe and other papers." End quote. He is played by actor Sullivan Jones, who admitted that he didn't know a lot about T. Thomas Fortune before he became a part of this cast, and that is not surprising. Even though T. Thomas Fortune played a big part in what would eventually become the civil rights movement in the United States, his name is often left out of the same conversations as people like Ida Wells, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, even though it was T. Thomas Fortune who gave Du Bois his first writing job. I mean, he started the National Afro-American League, which is a precursor to the NAACP, in 1887. Here's a photo of that organization in 1902, showing Ida Wells and Booker T. Washington on either side of that minister who's in the center. Now, if you've been around my channel for any length of time, then you probably already know that I don't pedestalize those civil rights leaders from the past. I think that some of them were well-intentioned at times, and at other times, not so much. I often question the motive behind their fighting and marching. But that's a topic for another day, or maybe later today after you watch this video. You can look at some of my other videos on those guys to understand my position. I have published videos that take critical looks at Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Marcus Garvey, the NAACP itself, when a couple of its members dressed like this for some costume party fun. Ron Karenga, the man who is often credited as being the founder of Kwanzaa and who had his own Black freedom group in the 1960s. He was also convicted of beating and torturing 2 Black women who he held as prisoners for weeks. There are also 2 separate videos that I published about 2 different Black civil rights leaders, each who referred to a Black woman they had an issue with as Aunt Jemima. In case you don't know who Aunt Jemima is or why that matters, because I do know that we have people who are watching this channel and they're not necessarily in this country. Hi, Rido, Boy and Shoe Crazy Lion, and everybody else who's watching. Aunt Jemima was an American breakfast brand that sold things like pancake mix and other breakfast items that actually started in the Gilded Age in 1889. Aunt Jemima was never a real person. Instead, she was a mammy caricature of a Black woman who served up pancakes with a big old smile and a rag on her head, and she spoke in broken English. While times were moving forward, Black Americans were too, getting jobs and educations and really assimilating themselves into American culture. Aunt Jemima was happy to just keep doing what she had been doing on the plantation, serving up a big old heaping, helping old pancakes. And she did it with a smile on her face because she was too ignorant to know any better. This is what 2 Black civil rights leaders called 2 different Black women. This is part of the reason why I've learned to not take most Black civil rights leaders and organizations too seriously. I mean, people who say that they are fighting for the rights of Black people, calling Black women Aunt Jemima? Were they fighting for Black people or just Black men? Those 2 civil rights guys, by the way, were Curtis Graves and Cecil B. Moore, 2 Black men with fair complexions. And Curtis Graves got the nickname the Agitator at the height of his career. T. Thomas Fortune was also called the Agitator in his day. Well, this video is not about those civil rights guys, but T. Thomas Fortune, another Black man who fought for the civil rights of Black people and had, at times, his own strange remarks about Black women. He also happened to have a very fair complexion, so light that he was often taken for white. We'll look into a story that conveys how his outward appearance likely helped him to excel a little bit, and more on the life of T. Thomas Fortune, another Gilded Age character who was a real-life person. This is not a hit piece about T. Thomas Fortune, nor a love letter to him, but rather just a look into the life of a man who did a lot of good, but probably, like you and I, could have done a little bit better. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content. And please hit that like button to support this video. Thank you. In case you are one of the people who watches the TV show, The Gilded Age, I want to let you know that T. Thomas Fortune looked nothing like the actor who plays him. If you don't watch the show and you're simply here because you like historical content, thank you. We're about to get into his real life right now. Fortune practically looked like a white man. And to be clear, I'm not bringing this up to say that this was a poor casting choice. I don't think that a good actor necessarily has to look like the person whom he or she portrays. I'm bringing this up because T. Thomas Fortune's complexion and features were so close to white that he existed in a way that was very different from what it would have been for a man who looks like Sullivan Jones, the actor who plays him. You'll see that in a news story that I share with you later in this video. The T in T. Thomas Fortune stands for Timothy. He was born into slavery as Timothy Thomas Fortune on October 3rd, 1856, in Marianna, Florida, on the Eli P. Moore plantation. His father was Emmanuel Fortune Sr. He was a shoemaker and tanner, meaning someone who converted animal skin into leather. After the Civil War, he was elected to the Florida legislature during the Reconstruction era. His strategy to keep himself safe was to have a moderate political stance. No ideations too far to the right or too far to the left so as to not upset either side. But that plan didn't keep him safe from the Ku Klux Klan. They gained a lot of strength in the 1870s, and Emmanuel Fortune became one of their targets, forcing Emmanuel to move his family from their home to Jacksonville, Florida. By the time that he died in 1897, this is what an obituary in the Herald and Review had to say about his career. Quote, he had been a member of the Florida legislature, marshal of the city in Jacksonville, and had filled minor local and county offices. End quote. Now, you might be thinking something like, wow, that's really impressive for a Black man to have been able to accomplish those things in the 1800s. Well, here's what was written about Emmanuel Fortune's parents, who are T. Thomas Fortune's grandparents, in that same obituary. Quote, his mother was an octoroon, and his father was an Irishman. End quote. So his father was white, and his mother was practically white. In case you're not familiar with that term, an octoroon refers to someone who has 1/8 African ancestry, meaning 1 great-grandparent who is Black and 7 who are white. Octoroon isn't a term that's used today because it is an offensive term, but also because today we would call a person with that small of a percentage of Blackness white. Like, who would look at them and know? An example of a notable octoroon is Louisa Piquet, who was born into slavery and obtained freedom only because her master died. Remarks about her looks compared her to a white woman, which only makes sense. She looked white because, for the most part, she was. Then there was T. Thomas Fortune's mother, Sarah Jane Myers Fortune. As is often the case when I'm researching, or at least attempting to research women from this era, there was not a lot of information to find out about Sarah Jane. I was able to find out that she had 5 children with Emmanuel Fortune, 3 daughters and 2 sons, and I learned that she died in 1871. I found a picture of what someone says is a picture of her online, but it's not from a site that I trust, so I did not include that picture in this video. I like to have at least 2 sources that have the same information in them before I feel comfortable sharing the information with you, so that at least I can verify, cross-verify, find some way to check it before I bring it to you. The Miami Herald said that Emmanuel and Sarah Fortune had 5 children, but T. Thomas Fortune is the only one about whom I saw a lot of information. Because T. Thomas Fortune's father was a senior, Ernest Fortune Sr., I presume that there must have been an Ernest Fortune Jr., and I did see a brief mention of him in one source that said that he was the co-owner of the New York Age, owning it with T. Thomas early in his career. I found a copy of an obituary, but I couldn't verify the original source. But back to T. Thomas Fortune. After the Civil War, Union soldiers provided a very basic education for the Black children in T. Thomas's town. He learned as much as he could and continued to build on his education throughout his life, whether it was through formal education or apprenticeships. While his father was working in the Florida legislature, T. Thomas was also working there as a page, delivering various forms of correspondence, filing papers, tasks of that nature. After his family fled to Jacksonville, you could say that Thomas got his start in his newspaper career. It was there, for a paper called the Daily Union, that he found work as a printer's apprentice. After working there for some time and learning a great deal, a Black congressman found him another job in Delaware, working in a customs office. From there, he went on to attend Howard University while working part-time for another newspaper. Then he returned home and married Carrie Smiley, who was his childhood sweetheart. Since I've mentioned her, let me tell you the little bit about her that I was able to learn. You know, girls in history. She had 2 children with T. Thomas Fortune, and after he moved into his grand house called Maple Hall, shortly after she moved into that house with him, she separated from him, and she died in 1940 from a heart attack. I cannot express how frustrating it is to only be able to find out so little about these women. Pretty much the only thing that I'm able to find out is when they got married, if they had children, and when they died. That's pretty common, and it's unfortunate. She died in 1940, we know, but in this point of the story, as far as T. Thomas Fortune is concerned, she's still alive, and I will get back to that Maple Hall house, but let's continue. After Fortune married Carrie, he stayed in Jacksonville for a while and went back to work on the paper where he had been an apprentice, the Daily Union. Then he moved to New York to work for the New York Globe, a Black newspaper. This was a time when the media was pretty segregated, so it's not uncommon to have newspapers that cater to Black audiences and newspapers that cater to white audiences. So it's nothing for us to get upset about in 2023. That's just the way that it was. He was a writer and an editor at the New York Globe, and that's where his career really seemed to take off. And from this point, a lot of quick stories written about him would pretty much say, the rest is history, and then they tell you when he died. But I did a little digging, as I often do, as I always do, and I found one stop in his career that he made before he got to the Globe, one stop in New York. And it gives an interesting look into his life at that time. It was when he was working for a religious publication called The Weekly Witness. I found the news article from 1880, and I'm going to share it with you. I really enjoy sharing these news stories from the past because I think that they give us a more colorful look and realistic look at how people lived then and how they thought and even how they spoke, because this was a time before political correctness was a thing, so people wrote in a really frank way. And I think that sometimes these newspapers and even magazines give us a look that's less polished than what we get in history books, and therefore a more real look at things. This article was called Colored Men at the Case: Trouble in the Office of a So-Called Religious Contemporary. And the story reads, quote, I'm going to say bear with me because it's kind of a long story. I'm going to read most of it, not all of it, but just bear with me. Quote, 2 colored compositors were working quietly at their cases yesterday in the office of the Weekly Witness, and 6 white compositors who had quit work and refused to work with them were lounging about the room. The colored men had been working for the paper for several months in a room below, where no objection to their presence was made by 6 white men employed in mailing. It appears that the work on the Witness got behind last Tuesday night, and as there was insufficient light in the mailroom, the colored men took their cases upstairs and placed them on the vacant stands that had been used for the Daily Witness. The white men grumbled a little, but they did not stop work, and the paper went to press as usual. But on Wednesday morning, there was trouble, and 6 of the 8 white men refused to work any longer unless the colored men were removed. The foreman was out for breakfast, And when he came back, the white men stated their case to him. The substance of their story was they thought it was very bad that 6 white men should be made to give way, as they put it, to a couple of niggers. The foreman was first inclined to temporize and put the colored men in their former place downstairs, but on reflection, he concluded that he would not accede to the demand. In explanation of the matter, he said yesterday, now this is the foreman talking, "You see, this circus all went on while I was away. When I got back, I was going to put the colored men back in their old places, but I couldn't make up my mind to do it. I had found them to be steady, sober men. They were civil and gentlemanly and good workmen, and they had helped us out when we wanted help on the Daily Witness. And I just says, and it does say says, and I just says, these colored men shall stay if it takes the roof off." Okay, that's ending his quote. And there they are. The first one that came to work was Walter Sampson. After a while, he offered to get us a colored friend of his to help from Jacksonville, Florida, named T. Thomas Fortune. We found Fortune a sober, industrious, capable man. As for discharging the men, we don't propose to do it. Both Mr. DuBois and Mr. Cochran, the proprietors, are in favor of keeping the colored men as a matter of principle and justice, and we shall keep them at all hazards. Pause. Before we go on, I want to let you know that this Walter Sampson guy isn't insignificant in the story of T. Thomas Fortune. Shortly after the story that we're reading right now concludes, months later, Walter Sampson went on to start his own paper called Rumors, and he hired T. Thomas Fortune to write for him. Rumors eventually changed its name to the New York Globe, one of the publications that is most commonly associated with T. Thomas Fortune, and that is definitely a part of his legacy. So back to the Weekly Witness now. I'm going to go back to the story, but I did skip a little bit. At this point, we're going to get into the physical descriptions of both Walter Sampson and T. Thomas Fortune. Remember, we're talking about 2 colored men whose being colored is causing such a ruckus that men can't get their work done. Listen closely to how they are described. Quote, Walter Sampson, the younger of the colored men, is about 23 years old, stoutly built, rather light complexion, straight and good-sized nose, of by no means African type, and curly hair. He is sprightly and gentlemanly in appearance, and might pass for a Spaniard. I cut off some more of the story in between this, but now we get to T. Thomas Fortune's description. Quote, T. Thomas Fortune, the other colored man, might easily pass for a bronzed southern white man. He is 28 years old. His nose is long and thin. His hair is straight. His lips are thin. His general appearance, not unlike a tall Indian. He says there's some Indian blood in his veins, but that he was formerly a slave and calls himself a Negro. Pause. Calls himself a Negro. It sounds like the writer is saying, he calls himself a Negro, but I wouldn't call him one. Am I the only one hearing the story of 2 men who have such a minuscule amount of blackness in them that people look at them and don't even see black or colored at that time? Men? Anyway, the story goes on to read, quote, Inquiry among the dissatisfied white compositors developed a rather bitter feeling against the colored men, not on account of their personal conduct, but purely on account of their color. It's simply a question of personal equality, said one. I don't propose to work with a Negro, said another. The proprietors of the Witness say they will not back down. End quote. So the 2 colored men had a favorable outcome after all. And I think that was the right decision. They were merely doing their work, doing their part to help the publication meet its deadline. But those physical descriptions are here for us to see. I must say that I cannot help but wonder if the outcome would have been different for colored men who actually looked like colored men. If T. Thomas Fortune had dark skin and a wide nose and thick lips and didn't look like a bronzed southern white man, Would he have been able to accomplish all that he had? Would he have gotten the position as the page in the Florida legislature if it had not been for his father, who again was only 1/16 Black? Would he have gotten hired as an apprentice at the Daily Union had he looked more like the actor who plays T. Thomas Fortune than how he actually did in real life? If he looked very different from how the foreman of the Weekly Witness described him, would he even have been able to get hired there? I don't know the answer for sure, but I can say that I doubt it. But let me know what you think in the comments. Thomas lived in a time when a rule of hypodescent was commonly applied to people who were racially mixed with Black and white. Hypodescent is defined as the automatic assignment of children of a mixed union between different racial groups to the group with the lower status, regardless of proportion of ancestry. Regardless of proportion of ancestry. So in other words, a man like T. Thomas Fortune's father, who had one completely white parent and one who was only 1/8 Black, even though he was by far mostly white, he would legally be recognized as Black simply because Black people held the lower socioeconomic position. So he looked in the mirror and saw what everyone else saw, a white man. Just like the guy at the beginning of this video who actually has a higher percentage of Black or African ancestry, according to his DNA, than T. Thomas Fortune's father. But the law of the land would not allow the Fortunes to be recognized as white. This still happens today. Former President Barack Obama is a good example. He doesn't look white, but he has a white parent. He's called the first Black president of the United States, when he is in fact the first biracial president. It is widely known that he has a white mother, yet he is called Black. I believe that one of the reasons that T. Thomas Fortune identified as Black or colored during his lifetime was because he felt that he had no choice. Now, maybe he would have chosen to identify as Black if he'd had a choice. I don't know for sure. If you're hearing this and the one-drop rule is coming to mind, you have the right idea. It's the same principle, but the one-drop rule is the most extreme form of hypodescent. Typically in the years right before and right after the Civil War, the cutoff marks were somewhere between 1/4 and 1/16, meaning that if you had less African or Black blood than 1/4 or 1/16, then you would be considered white. If you had more than that, then you were considered Black. That percentage requirement varied from state to state. But according to the one-drop rule, on the other hand, forget about any of those fractions. Having even 1% or less, any Black blood at all, made you Black or African. It's actually crazy to think in those terms today, especially when you consider all the people who have had their DNA ancestry tested. And you've seen the videos on YouTube when people use services like MyHeritage or 23andMe, and you'll see some person who is like completely a white guy, and he'll say, oh, I've got, 5% Black, and again, no one will look at that person and say, oh, that's a Black guy. That's a soul brother number one. It's just insane to me to think about today. And remember, this man from the beginning of the video is 4% Black. That's a higher percentage than T. Thomas Fortune's father for sure, maybe even higher than T. Thomas Fortune himself. And I have to mention as we go forward that to mention T. Thomas's racial makeup is not in any way to take away from any of the work that he's done or has been given credit for, or any of the accomplishments that he has achieved. In many things that he did, he was actually self-taught. He learned how to use the printing press. He was a gifted writer. He knew how to stir up people's emotions as an orator. He was a journalist. He was influential. He was the editor for the most highly circulated Black newspaper in his time. He accomplished those things, whether he chose to be Black or was told that he had to be Black. Those things happened. Those things existed. I will not take any of that away in this video. That's not the intent. But getting back to the New York Age, the most successful Black newspaper of its time because of its high circulation, again, he did that. But even though the paper was successful, it did struggle financially. And when it did, Booker T. Washington was there to put some cash in T. Thomas Fortune's hands. And in exchange for this kindness, sometimes T. Thomas Fortune would play the role of Booker T. Washington's pet. He would write and print whatever Booker T. Washington wanted him to. So, like many humans, there were times when sometimes he would bend his morals just to get some money. Fortune's life wasn't perfect, and too often his last name, Fortune, was ironic, because often for him, money was tight. There was pressure coming at him from a lot of angles, and to cope, he drank too much. His personal ideologies were radical, so he aligned himself with the radical thinkers of his day. But he was seen as two-faced because Booker T. Washington was conservative. And since often he was funding T. Thomas Fortune would do whatever Booker T. Washington wanted him to do. And sometimes that meant publicly criticizing those radical thinkers who he really did agree with in real life. And some of them he knew in person. Some of them, I'm sure, considered him a friend. But once Booker T. Washington and his cash stepped into T. Thomas Fortune's life, those friends didn't matter anymore. Fortune quickly earned a reputation for being a liar and a hypocrite and a traitor. But to add to his list of accomplishments, he and his wife reared 2 children who grew up to be successful. Their daughter, Jessie Fortune Bowser, was written about in Black society pages the same way that the daughters of the Astors and the Vanderbilts were. She became a teacher, which was a very respectable profession, especially during that time, and she married a teacher. Their son, Frederick Fortune, was also a member of Black society, like his sister. He was written about in the same society pages like she was. He studied and went on to become a doctor. Of course, before he became a doctor, he graduated high school, and he did that right in Red Bank, in the neighborhood where their big Maple Hall home was. And in that same year, 1910, T. Thomas Fortune lost his home. He had to leave Maple Hall. And a few years before that, his wife left him. Let's rewind. Buying that house in 1901 was the highlight of that decade for T. Thomas Fortune. It was a big deal for everybody. It was a big deal that this Black newspaper man was buying this big house in this exclusive neighborhood. It even made headlines. Then after that, it seemed like everything went downhill for T. Thomas Fortune. After getting settled into that big house, his wife left him. Then he suffered a mental and physical breakdown. He eventually recovered from those breakdowns, but after he did, he lost his home. All of this happened from the years 1901 to 1910. He fell into obscurity after the breakdown, and he even left journalism. He did eventually return to work, but he never gained the success that he had before, or the notoriety. And finally, on June 2nd, 1928, after years of declining health, T. Thomas Fortune passed away at Mercy Hospital in Philadelphia at the age of 71. Thankfully for him, while he was at the hospital, he got a lot of special attention from one doctor in particular, Dr. Frederick W. Fortune, his son. In addition to leaving behind his children, Maple Hall, though he lost the home, is still a part of Fortune's legacy. An Italian family named the Vaccarellis bought it and ran a commercial bakery there from 1918 until 2007. Even though the home was in their possession for almost a century, Maple Hall was named a National Historic Landmark because T. Thomas Fortune lived there. The house was on its last leg in the 2010s and looking quite ready for nothing more than demolition when Roger Mumford, a white residential developer was looking for a way to do his part to help ease racial tensions between Black and white people in America. His family immigrated from England to Virginia in the 1960s when he was only 7. And seeing the whites-only signs in public spaces never sat well with him, even as a child. And in the 2010s, it seemed as though race relations were only getting worse. Until that point, a group of protesters were able to raise awareness and raise their voices in protest against tearing down Maple Hall. But what they had not been able to raise was money. The money that was needed to repair the building and to keep it up and keep it going. Well, Roger Mumford bought the house from the Vaccarellis for $925,000 and completely renovated it, then turned it over to a nonprofit board under which the house now operates as the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center. And it looks stunning. If you don't know, I had a long career in construction management before I came to YouTube. And reading about some of the methods that Mumford employed to restore this structure was just fascinating to me. He used modern engineering and equipment where he could and for the things that he needed to, like elevating the house in order to repair the foundation and removing asbestos siding from the house. But he hired old-fashioned craftsmen to recreate intricate detailing in the home for things like replacement moldings and decorative rosettes so that they matched the deteriorated originals. I suspect that anyone visiting that house now would have a really good idea of what T. Thomas Fortune and his wife and children saw when they walked into their home for the first time in 1901. Mumford also built 4 luxury rental units on that 1-acre property to make the deal a financially viable one for himself. And when the series premiere of The Gilded Age aired last year, the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center had its doors open for a screening of the show. I think that's a good full circle moment for a man who had such an impact, but whose name has been relatively obscure in circles where it should be spoken. Like I said earlier, there are remnants of T. Thomas Fortune and a lot of men who are seen as Black political and civil rights leaders. If you want to see my videos about any of the ones who I mentioned earlier in this video, the link to a playlist will be in the description box for you. And I want to thank you, Trina, for buying me a coffee. I really needed it to get through this video. A few of you have bought me coffees, but Trina actually left her name. I see that there are people doing it anonymously, and I thank you. There are some ways to support the channel financially in the description box if that's something that you want to do. But all that I will ever ask of you, seriously, is to please watch, like, and share my content. You will never know what that does for me and for any of your favorite content creators. That really does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for supporting my content. I will see you on the next one. And yes, my coffee is from Shipley's in Texas. Yeehaw. My sources for this story are Herald and Review Archives, 1897, Red Bank Green, The Sun Archives, 1880, The Miami Herald Archives, 1995, Forgotten History, Center Highlights Civil Rights Pioneer T. Thomas Fortune by Deborah Yav on civic.org, The Birmingham Reporter Archives, 1928, The New York Age Archives, 1906, 1919, and 1940, and the Brooklyn Daily Eagle Archives, 1917. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the Hot Mess History. The link is in the description box.